Hello and welcome to another episode of From the Beginning here on Heavenward Thinking. Today we're continuing on in Genesis chapter 30. We're doing the second portion of it. Last week we talked about the favoritism that played such a devastating role in Jacob's family between his two wives and how they were competing to have children. This week we're going to leave that behind and move on to what's happening with Jacob during this time and what's happening with his relationship with Laban and his work ethic. We're going to see some changes in him and we're going to see how God is already working in his life and blessing him. So I'm going to start by reading in verse 25. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me on my way so I can go back to my own homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you." But Laban said to him, "If I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." He added, "Name your wages, and I will pay them." Jacob said to him, "You know how I have worked for you, and how your livestock has fared under my care. The little you had before I came has greatly increased, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. But now, when may I do something for my own household?" "What shall I give you?" he asked. "Don't give me anything," Jacob replied. "But if you will do this one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks and watching over them. Let me go through all your flocks today and remove from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-colored lamb, and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages. And my honesty will testify for me in the future. Whenever you check on the wages you have paid me, any goat in my possession that is not speckled or spotted, or any lamb that is not dark-colored, will be considered stolen." "Agreed," said Laban. "Let it be as you have said." That same day he removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats, all that had white on them, and all the dark-colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob continued to tend the rest of Laban's flocks. Jacob, however, took fresh-cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees, and made white strips on them by peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs, so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they mated in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Jacob set apart the young of the flock by themselves, but made the rest face the streaked and dark-colored animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself and did not put them with Laban's animals. Whenever the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the troughs in front of the animals, so they would mate near the branches. But if the animals were weak, he would not place them there. So the weak animals went to Laban, and the strong ones to Jacob. In this way the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks, and female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. So in this section we get a glimpse of Jacob's work ethic, and we already have seen a little bit of that in the previous chapters where he worked hard for Rachel and for Leah, and how he worked for many, many years. He had to work 7 years, and then he was tricked, and he worked another 7 years, and here he is. He's ready to go home and to do something for his own family. He wants to kind of build his legacy, build his family clan up, and prosper himself. He's worked for someone else. Now he's ready to move a chapter forward, and Laban doesn't want him to do that. Laban realizes, he says by divination, that he realizes that God blessed him because of Jacob. And rather than try to figure out why that is, or try to figure out how he can be a part of that blessing, or figure out a way for him to act in such a way that God is going to bless him, instead he decides, nope, you got to still work for me. I need to keep you around because you're just going to be the blessing around me. Rather than trying to earn it himself, he just wants to prosper off of Jacob and kind of take that blessing from him. But Jacob comes up with a way to be rewarded for his hard work. He comes up with a way and a plan. He's going to take all the speckled and spotted, and he's going to have his own flocks, while Laban is going to have the rest of the flocks. And Laban seems to find different ways, and we see that in the next couple chapters, where he changes the wages. He says, well, you can have the spotted, you can have the streaked, and then he keeps changing it over time. We see that later on. And when we see that already in this chapter, where he tries to remove the sheep and the goats from him so that Jacob won't get the ones that he was going to try to get. And he makes it so that he's being deceptive. Laban's being very deceptive toward Jacob, and he's using him. It's familiar to the beginning of Jacob's own story, right? Where we saw Jacob deceiving his brother Esau, where he was deceiving his father Isaac, where he was doing all these things to benefit himself and to get the blessings from other people. And then we see that Laban's doing the same thing. So whatever the reasons may be behind this, we're going to see in the next chapters, the preceding chapters, that God uses this story, this experience, these hard years of work, these hard years of suffering under other people's deception, other people's greed, other people's bad motives, we see that it changes Jacob. He's no longer the same man who he was when he was the deceptive one. And we see that God allows him to go through this, and it changes him, just as God allows us to go through things. It shouldn't be surprising for us when we mistreat people, when we deceive people, when we are greedy or we try to take blessings for ourselves and do things that are questionable. It shouldn't be surprising for us when we have to go through the same treatment ourselves. Oftentimes, that's how God is able to get our attention. He lets things happen to us to get us to realize, wow, that's who I am too. I need to change. I need to be different. And we see that Jacob changes. Whether or not it had anything to do with this part of the story, it seems to me, as we read this, that this story had something to do with it. It seems that God allowed this to happen for a reason, and that reason seems to be to change who Jacob was. God had already started to change him. If you remember when he had the dream and he changed his name and he was doing all these different things, God promised to bless him and he got him right on the right track. But Jacob hasn't gone through the full process yet. It's a long process. God had an initial change that he started in Jacob, but he had to use many, many years of hard work, of going through difficult times for Jacob to really come to the man he was supposed to become, to be a very different man when he eventually goes back and has to face his brother and face his parents. And so in our own lives, when we go through difficult times, we should look at them not just as difficult, frustrating times, but as times where maybe God is trying to get our attention. Maybe God is trying to teach us something. It's not necessarily a punishment for the things we've done. Sometimes it is consequences for the sins that we've done, but sometimes God allows us to go through things because he wants to change who we are. He wants to make us more like Jesus. He wants to make us different. And that certainly seems to be the case with Jacob, and that certainly seems to be the case with us as Christians. We go through difficult times so that we can be refined by God, so that we can be more like Jesus and shine for Jesus in a dark world. If we don't go through the difficult times, then we're not going to be changed. If Jacob hadn't gone through this situation, he might not have been prepared for what lay ahead. He may not have been prepared to go back and face Esau. He needed to go through this time of adversity. He needed to go through this time of growing, and God was using all of this to get his attention. So we see in this passage, he's going through this difficult time. He's having these tensions with Laban, and it seems to be getting worse and worse as the story goes on. At first, everything was great when he first met Laban, if you remember a couple chapters back. Everything was great. He was excited to have Jacob there, but he continually uses and abuses and misuses Jacob throughout the stories, whether it was deceiving him when he was thinking he was going to marry Rachel and it was actually Leah, when it was having to work another 7 years to pay off for both of the wives, or whether now it's changing his wages multiple times and trying to be deceptive and not really give him his due. He's not paying him fairly, it seems to be, what's in this story. Whatever the case may be in this, we see that God is still with Jacob, not just in showing him that he's going to be a different person, not just in teaching him different things, but he is there with him, blessing him. And we see that because even though Laban tried all these deceptive things, Jacob was still abundantly blessed by God. And that just goes to show us that when God promises he's going to bless us, when he promises us something that he's going to fulfill, it doesn't matter what comes our way. Nothing is going to be able to stop that blessing of God. Nothing's going to be able to prevent God from fulfilling his promises that he's made, these unconditional promises like he made to Jacob. Even though Jacob had made many mistakes in his life, God made unconditional promises through the Abrahamic covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and now Jacob, and then continuing on with his family line. God had made these promises that he was going to do something, and it didn't matter what happened. God was going to fulfill those promises. And he does the same thing for us today. He promises us that he is never going to leave us. He promises us that he is always going to be with us, that if we ask, we will receive. He promises all kinds of different things through Scripture that he is going to fulfill. And even though the enemy tries to throw everything our way, even though other people try to mess things up, try to take the blessing from us, try to do all kinds of things against us, persecute us, mistreat us, whatever it may be, God always finds a way to make his plan happen and his purpose come to fulfillment. And that is the case in Jacob's story here. We see that even though Laban's doing everything he can to prevent Jacob from abundantly increasing and trying to keep all the blessing himself, we see that God continually blesses Jacob abundantly and in a great way, once again shining through and showing that Jacob's the one who has the blessing, not Laban in this chapter. And Laban recognizes that in the future and is able to come to terms with this. And eventually there is some reconciliation between these two men, but it has to go through this process. As we talked about earlier, we have this whole story as a process to change people's lives, just as it happens in our own cases. When we go through crazy situations, it's going to change our lives and the lives of those around us. We need to be faithful, to have the hard work ethic that Jacob had in this chapter. Even though he was being mistreated, he did the right things. He was a man of integrity, a man of honesty now, which was totally different than what we knew about Jacob in the future, or in the past. We already see what he's doing. And in this chapter, he uses that hard work ethic to stand out, to be different than Laban. And we're called to do the same thing as Christians. We're called to be different than other people. When they mistreat us, we're not called to mistreat them back or try to get even with them. We're called to be different, to continue to be a man or a woman of integrity, to live according to the ways of Jesus, not the ways of this world. So with a heavenward thinking perspective on this chapter, we're able to see how God is able to do mighty things, continually bless even when all odds are against us. And we're able to see that we need to be men and women of integrity, remain faithful to God even when the world's against us. And we need to realize that sometimes when we go through things, God is using them to refine us, to shape us, to mold us into the men and women he wants us to be. So I'd encourage you to look at all these things in this chapter, read it again, and look forward next week as we talk about the next portion of this, where Jacob is going to actually leave Laban, and we're going to see how there's going to be some more conflict ahead before we get to the reconciliation chapters in the future. Join us next time for another episode of From the Beginning here on Heavenward Thinking.